Hey folks, we're going to make a special tool to take these forks apart, these standard uprights. A special tool to hold the damper rod assembly, sometimes they call it a piston, inside the fork so you can get the cap bolt off the bottom of the fork tube. Sometimes it's a real pain in the butt, and sometimes the special tools are very expensive. I'll show you how you can make one, so let's get right to it. Howdy folks, I'm working on this 87 Virago. One thing I have to do on it is fork seals. As you can see, I have the right fork off, and I'm not going to show you the rebuilding of the forks. What I'm going to show you is making a special tool that you need to get these forks apart. And the reason why I'm showing you this one is because it's real classic standard that what you might need to do on one of these older bikes, even up to the early 2000s, with these upright forks. Alright, so we're going to go over here to the messy bench, and I'm going to show you this part once I get it out. But inside here there is a piston rod. There is essentially a damper rod, and it's a fixed part, and it'll be like a Teflon piston ring around, like a little ring in a groove. And this thing's got a wider head and it tapers down all the way down to the bottom. And then there is a threaded part. Sometimes there's a little cap doohickey, I'll show you that too. That goes into a cap bolt. There's a cap bolt underneath here. You might be able to see it right there. Anyway, I'll show you when it comes apart. But what you have to do is you have to hold that rod in there to, number one, get that bolt out, and number two, torque it up when you're done properly. Because pretty much every service manual I've ever read calls for like blue Loctite on that. So it's going to be stuck. So we have to hold that. So again, once I get it apart, I'll show you what's in there. But essentially, what it looks like is a hole with like a 12-point socket type thing. In other words, it's an internal socket. All right, and so you have to put something down inside of it to hold it. Now, generally, when I do this, I have tools that I previously made up for this purpose, like this. And this one is too big, and the other ones I have are too small. And sometimes you run into this where you have the Goldilocks effect. One's too big, one's too small, but the one you need is just right. And so I found that, and I'm going to show you how I did that. Now you can't get down there to measure it, so you have to kind of stick something down to test it. So what I did was I just dug through my bolt drawer, and I took a piece of wood dowel, and I screwed a bolt on it that I thought was about the right size. This was my second attempt. The first one would have worked, but it wasn't as tight as I'd like it. I'll measure this up here in a minute. And then I stuck the other end into a socket on a 6-inch extension. So then what I do is I put it inside carefully and gently. Of course, you can always get it out if it falls in there. And then you wiggle it around, and you notice that it's grabbing that. See, up here it's spinning, and then it just drops down into that spot. So this is a nice fit. All right, so let's measure this up. I'll tell you what this one is, and then we're going to do some work on it to make it into a tool that we can actually hold that piece with. Okay, let's see what size nut this is. In this case, it's a 7/8 nut. Now, granted, this is only a 6-point nut, you know, but it isn't exactly what we want. We would want something to fit all those little points in there, but it will work, but we have to modify it a slight bit. So I'm going to use the lathe for this, but you don't need a lathe. I'm going to face this off, this end here, because the problem with this is you want a nice sharp edge because of the radius that's cut, or I should say formed on this nut. This is a Chinese nut that you know, it's going to take up some of the room, and that's a very shallow area this has to sit in. So I'm going to take one end and I'm going to face it. If you don't have a lathe, just use a grinder wheel or something and flatten it out best you can. This does not have to be precision perfect. All right, we're just making it so it fits better in there. Almost there, but you get the idea. Let me finish that up and then we'll come back. All right, so you can see what I did was I just faced it off, so compared to the back there, that radius is gone, so it's nice and flat. You'll get full capture. Again, that area we're going to stick it into is actually very shallow. Okay, so what I'm going to do to make this into a tool is I'm going to face this off just because, or you can grind it if you want, just to get the zinc off of it. And then I'm going to take a scrap 3/8 drive socket of the appropriate size, and I'm just going to put it on here and weld it. All right, that way I have something obviously I can put into a 3/8 drive long extension, drop it down in there and capture it like I kind of demonstrated with that wood dowel before. All right, now if you don't have a welder, you can still do this, and it isn't too hard to do. Find yourself a bolt. You'll need 2 of these, by the way. Find yourself a bolt that fits this, preferably a grade 5 soft bolt like this. And this isn't the right bolt. I think this is 7/16 14. This is probably half 13, but anyway, it's just for demonstration purposes. So put your first bolt on. Let's say that that's the first bolt, and then put this one on, which is your bolt that you want to use for the tool. All right, and then what you want to do is you want to snug those 2 bolts up pretty good, but just leave a teeny bit of this sticking out, maybe, you know, 1/8 of an inch or so sticking out on the bottom. Then take it over to your vise or other really solid metal object like an anvil or a big piece of steel, and then take your ball peen and start whaling on this and go ahead and peen the crap out of the end of this thing. You want to smush this thing out real good. All right, so there's no possible chance that the nut's going to back off, because when you're turning it counterclockwise, when this is held up with the part you're trying to capture inside the fork, it's going to want to spin the other way, of course. It's going to want to spin off. So when you smush this over, it can't do that. You just have to peen it over real good. The nut on the inside is to lock it up for the other purpose when you tighten it. You can also use some Loctite, like red Loctite, and let it sit for the appropriate amount of time, or some super glue even, or you can use some some JB Weld, and of course you'll have to wait overnight for most of those options there, at least not the super glue. But what'll happen is it'll just be extra insurance to hold this together, and when you tighten this lock nut against this nut, what's going to happen is when you go to tighten it, it won't go up this nut and away from the peened end. Now essentially, you might say to yourself, well, I think it's going to overcome that. I've tried to double nut things before, but you don't have to have a lot of a lot of resistance torque on this to tighten it up. You do to take them out, because they're tighter than hell with the Loctite in there. But to tighten it back up, you really only need to hold it a little bit. And then once that cap bolt seats, and the friction of the part itself to the bottom of the fork tube, the fork lower I should say, it's going to really tighten up no problem. I've had them tighten up even without a tool before. So once you get them, the cap bolt nice and clean, and the part on the fork, the damper rod nice and clean, and then put a little blue Loctite on and put it in with a new crush washer, and then you'll be able to just tighten it up no problem. It's the loosening part that you really need a good adherence to, so that's why you want to peen the end over. Now to hold it in a socket, you just take the appropriate size socket, and then take and put some paper inside the socket and just ram this thing in so it binds up in there. And then you can drop it down in without it falling out of the socket. I recommend using a short socket so it can bottom out inside the socket, because a long one's going to go down and it's just not going to be right. And that way you can go down into the part that you're going to hold, undo it, and then when you go to tighten it back up, again, worst case scenario is all you have to do is re-sock up this lock nut on the back side of it. And with this one pushing against that one, it's bound to hold really well. Then you can hold it to tighten it up. So that's one way you could do it without a welder. But again, I'm going to go ahead and face this backside off lightly just to clean it up. Again, for welding, find a scrap socket. We'll just put a couple of tacks on it to hold it in place, and then we'll put it down in there, and I'll show you the parts when it comes out, what they look like. Okay, the only caveat to this is if you're going to use a bolt with a nut attached to it, as I described before, you obviously have to drive it with a socket, as I said, and you put a little piece of paper and you shove it into the socket, and then it'll hold in there when you drop it in. But you got to make sure the socket fits into the fork tube first. So make sure you check that, and if it does, then you're good. You can keep going this way. If it doesn't, then you're going to have to come up with a different way to do it. And again, the only other way I'd recommend is to weld it to a 3/8 drive socket like I did, and then complete the operation that way. Alright, so that's what it looks like. You know, I'm no welder. Well, I can weld a little bit, but you just got to tack it on there. I mean, I was kind of just, you know, I don't want to overcomplicate things. I mean, when do I ever do that? Now we're going to stick it down in there with the extensions, and I'll show you how it works. Okay, so fork is all the way collapsed. The tube, that is. You want it collapsed. And I'm grabbing it good. And what I like to use this little 3/8 drive, like a little breaker bar up here. See that right there? Now I'm going to feel this. That's going to be an 8mm hex. I'm pretty sure. I don't even have to look at it. I've done so many of these damn things. So again, I'm going to show you to you when I get it apart, because it's going to be easier. And I'm not going to show you the whole fork rebuild. I'm just showing you how to get this part out here. Okay. So I'm going to get a hex on a 3/8 drive impact. Now this is going to make a mess because there's always schmoo inside there, so put a pan down or something. I mean, I got my scrap metal bin down there. I don't really care at this point, you know, for that. So what I'm going to do now is just take this and move you back so you can see a little bit better. So what I'm going to do now is just take this and make sure it's on reverse and hold the top one really well. Make sure this is fully engaged. You don't want it spinning. Sometimes they can be really, really tight. Shmoo! Release the shmoo. Alright, so that come out easy. And it held just perfect. There's your 8mm socket head bolt. That's an M10 by 1.0 fine thread metric pitch bolt, cap bolt. Yeah, very typical for these. Sometimes you'll see an M10 125, but most times you see the M10 1.0. Yeah, so that's what that is. And there's your crush washer. Crush washer? Yeah, your crush washer. All right, you got to put a new one of those on, which I'm pretty sure I have, hopefully. Okay, all I want to do now is get the guts out, which is that. There it comes. Come on, baby, because I want to show you that. You want to pay attention to what comes out and in what order it comes out in. And there's probably a piece down inside there still, which is a little cup that this sits in. Okay, so I dumped the fork tube out, and when you do this, just, you know, pour it into a pan, the innards come out, and usually you just get a piston like this, which is a damper rod. Here's the threads on the bottom that goes through. There's something in the bottom of that tube. Usually there's a cap that goes over this, which, I don't know, I'll dig it out and show you. That's kind of like a spot that it ultimately seats on, but it slides in here fairly snug fit. Aluminum piece, but this is the end that tool goes into that you have to kind of guess at if you don't already know the size. Now, I don't know if I mentioned it before because I've been I got a couple phone calls, so I've been kind of scatterbrained here, more than normal. But you can find on forums a lot of times guys will say, well, a certain size bolt fits that, and because they've done it before. But this is a 7/8, as I said before. And you saw how I modified it, and this is how it fits in there. It's definitely snug enough. And I don't know if that's 12 point or 16 point, whatever the hell it is, but it just goes in there, and then you can hold it in place. Now you probably could shove maybe a like a wood, what do they call it, like a broom handle. I've heard of that, and I've heard of some other ways to do it, like try to crack the cap bowl on the bottom while the spring is still in, because the spring is essentially pushing down. Your spring's going to come down and sit on top of this like that. Alright? And so when the spring pressure is down on top of this rod, remember this is fixed to the lower part, or the bottom of the fork. So it's stationary. The top of the fork is what's sliding up and down. The spring here is to stop it from slamming when it goes fully extended. It won't compress all the way because the spring will not allow it to, so you can't really bottom the thing out and slam metal to metal, but if this wasn't here you could on the upstroke, so that's what this is for. It's a damper spring for that. But anyway, that's getting into it deeper than I wanted to. I just wanted to show you the tool here. And then, again, when you take it apart, just make sure you remember where everything goes or how it came out, you know. Here's that piece that's down on the bottom that slips into this, and this is, again, really classic, these uprights from the era. You know, 80s all the way up to about 2000. That my old Bandit 1200 had exactly the same type of internals in those upright forks, and so this was just stuck on the bottom because sometimes when you put the Loctite through it, it gets around there between this piece and the bottom of the lower fork tube and just sticks in there, so it'll come right out. But that goes in, then that goes in, then the rest of it just goes in. But again, I'm not here to show you how to rebuild a fork. I'm here to give you some instruction on what you can do to make the special tool so you can rebuild the fork. Alright, so that's how you can make a special tool to get these forks apart, these uprights, the old style like this. I have a video on the Kawasaki, what is it, the Concourse 14, that's what it is, the inverted forks on my channel. If I remember, I'll link to it. That way you can look at those, which is another way to do it with much different special tools. This is very simple compared to those, but you're going to need something to hold that in place, you know, that damper rod down in there. So hopefully this gets you to that point where you can actually take these apart and not have to buy any expensive special tools. If you like what you saw, subscribe, ring the bell, comment. I'd always appreciate comments. Like the video, share, you know the whole bit. You're smart, you know what to do. I know what to do too. I need to get back to work. So thanks for watching. Don't just repair, restore. Catch you on next video.